Tom Bradbury was exactly 43 miles outside of Portland when the first drops of rain began to streak across his windshield. The same distance, he realized with a grim sort of humor, that separated him from his old life in Boston. The life he'd fled 3 hours ago with nothing but a hastily packed duffel bag and the bitter taste of Sarah's last words still burning in his mouth. "You're a coward, Tom. Always have been. Always will be." The fluorescent lights of the mini-mart flickered ahead like dying fireflies against the New Hampshire darkness. He hadn't planned on stopping. Not here. Not anywhere until he reached Portland. But his bladder had other ideas after 3 cups of truck stop coffee and 6 hours behind the wheel. Besides, the rain was getting worse, and the Camry's wipers had been making that scraping sound that meant they were about due for replacement. The digital clock on his dashboard read 11:47 p.m., numbers that seemed to float in the vast emptiness surrounding exit 23 of I-95, a stretch of road where even the moon appeared to have turned its back on the world below. Tom remembered this stretch of highway from his childhood trips to his grandmother's house in Maine. Even then, there had been something about it that made him uneasy. Something in the way the trees pressed close to the road, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers in the dark. Just in and out, Tom muttered to himself, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. 2 minutes, tops. The car's engine ticked as it cooled, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the pressing silence of the empty parking lot. His was the only vehicle there, unless you counted the rusted-out Ford pickup that looked like it had been abandoned sometime during the Carter administration. A bumper sticker, faded almost to illegibility, read "I Heart Suit Maine" in what had once been bright red letters. Tom hadn't noticed the pickup when he'd first pulled in. Strange how things could hide in plain sight, even under the harsh glare of sodium lights. Like the truth about Sarah's late nights at the office, which he'd somehow managed not to see for 8 months until he'd come home early last Tuesday and found her with David from accounting. David, with his perfect teeth and his MBA and his fucking country club membership. "It's not what you think," Sarah had said. But of course it was exactly what he thought, had been thinking somewhere in the back of his mind for months now. The door chime rang out as he entered, a cheerful ding-ding that felt like a lie. The fluorescent lights inside buzzed like angry wasps, casting everything in a sickly pallor that made the faded linoleum floor look like aged cheese. The place smelled of industrial cleaner and something else, something older and more organic that made Tom think of his grandmother's root cellar. "Hello?" he called out. His voice bounced off the walls, returning to him smaller and more uncertain than when it had left. No answer. Of course there's no answer, he thought. It's just one of those automated places. Swipe your card. Use the facilities, get back on the road. Get to Portland. Start over. The men's room was at the far end of a short hallway, past a wall of vending machines that hummed with mechanical life. Their soft drone reminded Tom of the way his grandmother's refrigerator used to sound, a sound that had always made him uneasy as a child, though he'd never been able to explain why. He remembered asking her once why it made that noise, and she'd smiled that thin smile of hers and said, "Everything's got its own song, Tommy. Some songs we're not meant to understand." He was washing his hands when he heard it. The distinctive crunch of tires on gravel. Someone else pulling in. The thought should have been comforting. Another human being, sharing this little island of civilization in the darkness. But something in Tom's hindbrain, some primitive part that had never forgotten what it was like to be prey, sent a warning signal straight to his adrenal glands. He dried his hands slowly, listening. The engine outside didn't shut off. It idled, a low rumble that seemed to seep through the concrete walls like poison gas. The sound reminded him of something, but it took him a moment to place it. The sound of the car that had been following him for the last 20 miles, always maintaining the same distance, never quite catching up but never falling behind either. "You're being ridiculous," he told himself. "It's probably just some other traveler, same as you. Probably just as eager to get back on the road." But when he opened the bathroom door, he knew immediately that wasn't true. The man standing by the vending machines was too still. He wasn't examining the snack selection or reaching for his wallet. He was just waiting. A big man, well over 6 feet, wearing a denim jacket despite the summer heat. His face was mostly hidden beneath the brim of a Red Sox cap, but what Tom could see of it was all angles and shadows. like something carved from wood by an artist who'd never actually seen a human face. "Evening," Tom said, trying to keep his voice steady. The word came out an octave higher than he'd intended. The man didn't respond, didn't move, just stood there, blocking Tom's path to the exit. Water dripped from his jacket onto the linoleum floor, forming a small puddle that reflected the fluorescent lights like a mirror into another world. Tom's heart began to pound, each beat so hard he could feel it in his throat. He took a step backward, then another. His grandmother's voice echoed in his head. "Some songs were not meant to understand, Tommy." But this wasn't a song. This was a silence so deep it seemed to have weight, seemed to press against his eardrums like he was underwater. That's when the man moved. It wasn't a lunge or a grab, nothing so dramatic. He simply reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew something that gleamed dully under the fluorescent lights. A hunting knife with a blade that looked long enough to pierce clean through a man's chest and come out the other side. The handle was wrapped in worn leather, and there was something carved into the blade. Symbols that might have been letters once, before time and use had worn them down to meaningless scratches. "Wallet," the man said. His voice was surprisingly soft, almost gentle, with a hint of a Maine accent that made Tom think of long winters and isolated farmhouses. "Phone too. Then we're going for a little walk." Tom's mind went blank, then shifted into overdrive. He saw everything with crystal clarity. The knife's serrated edge, the man's yellowed fingernails, the way the fluorescent light caught on what looked like old bloodstains on the man's boots. He noticed details that seemed absurd in their specificity, like how the man's jacket had a tear in the left sleeve that had been carefully sewn up with black thread, or how his red socks cap had a small coffee stain on the brim. "Please," Tom heard himself say. "I have kids." The lie tumbled out automatically, as if some part of his brain had decided that fatherhood might grant him immunity from whatever this man had planned. But even as he said it, he thought of the pregnancy test he'd found in Sarah's trash 3 months ago, the one he'd never asked her about because he was afraid of the answer. The man's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but something worse. A look of genuine amusement, like a cat watching a mouse try to negotiate. "No, you don't," he said softly. "You're running from something. I can always tell. Makes it easier, really. Nobody misses the runners." Tom's blood turned to ice water in his veins. Because the man was right, he was running. Running from Sarah, from David, from accounting, from the life he'd built and lost in Boston. Running from himself, maybe. "Don't make this difficult," the man continued, taking a step forward. "I've had a long night, and I'd hate to make it longer." He gestured with the knife, a casual movement that somehow made it more threatening. "Besides, you're not the first. Won't be the last either. It's just business." Tom's back hit the wall. The bathroom door was to his right, the hallway stretching away to his left. The man was between him and the exit, but maybe if he could get back into the bathroom, lock the door by some time? He never got the chance to find out if that plan would work. As he started to move, the man closed the distance between them with shocking speed. Tom felt the knife press against his ribs. Not cutting, not yet, but promising. "I said we're going for a walk," the man whispered, his breath hot against Tom's ear. The smell of coffee and something metallic, blood, made Tom's stomach turn. Through those back doors, into the woods. Nice and quiet, just the two of us. That's when Tom knew with absolute certainty that he was going to die. The knowledge didn't come as a shock or even a surprise. It settled over him like a heavy blanket, smothering thought and reason. His legs moved automatically as the man guided him toward the emergency exit at the end of the hall. He thought about Sarah, about how she'd never know what happened to him. Would she think he'd just run away? Would she care? The door opened with a crash that seemed to echo across the entire state of New Hampshire. Cool night air rushed in, carrying with it the smell of pine needles and wet earth. The rain had stopped, but water still dripped from the trees, each drop hitting the ground with a sound like distant gunfire. They walked into the darkness together, the man slightly behind Tom, knife pressed firmly against his back. The woods swallowed them whole, trees looming overhead like silent witnesses. Tom thought he could hear something moving in the darkness beyond the trees. Something big, something that didn't belong in a New Hampshire forest. After about 50 yards, the man said, "Stop." Tom stopped. The ground beneath his feet was soft with decades of fallen pine needles, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called out, a sound so normal it seemed obscene in the context of what was happening. "Turn around." Tom turned. In the darkness, the man's face was finally fully visible. It wasn't the face of a monster or a demon, just a man, probably in his 50s, with tired eyes and 3 days' worth of stubble. Somehow that was worse. Monsters, at least, had an excuse for being what they were. "Kneel down," the man said, and Tom noticed for the first time that there was something strange about his eyes. They reflected the minimal light like a cat's eyes would, gleaming yellow in the darkness. Tom's knees buckled before his brain could process the command. The ground was damp beneath him, soaking through his jeans. He thought of Sarah again, of the way she used to laugh at his jokes before they stopped being funny, of the way she'd looked at him that last time. Not with anger or hatred, but with something worse. Pity. "Please," he tried one last time. "Whatever this is about." "Shut up," the man said, but there was no real anger in his voice. If anything, he sounded bored. "You know what this is about. Same thing it's always about. Wrong place, wrong time." He paused, then added almost kindly, "If it helps, you're not special. Just another runner who stopped when he shouldn't have." He raised the knife, and in that moment, Tom saw something move behind the man. Something vast and impossible that seemed to unfold from between the trees. It had too many angles, too many limbs, too many everythings. It was darkness given form, silence given shape, and it was reaching out with appendages that weren't quite arms toward the man with the knife. The man must have sensed something because he started to turn, the knife still raised. But he never completed the movement. The thing from the darkness wrapped around him like smoke, like shadow, like a memory of fear. The man made a sound that wasn't quite a scream, more like the noise a rabbit makes when a hawk's talons close around it. The knife fell to the ground with a soft thud. Tom closed his eyes. He heard something that might have been footsteps running away, might have been branches breaking, might have been the sound of reality itself tearing at the seams. When he opened them again, he was alone. The knife lay on the ground where it had fallen. Tom picked it up with trembling fingers, half expecting it to dissolve like a dream, but it was solid and real in his hand. In the dim light, he could finally make out what was carved into the blade. Names. Dozens of them. Some so old they were barely legible, others fresh enough that they might have been carved yesterday. He ran back to his car, threw the knife in the trunk, and drove. He drove until sunrise, until the horror of the night began to feel like something that had happened to someone else. He drove all the way to Portland, found a cheap motel, and slept for 14 hours straight. When he woke up, he convinced himself it had all been a nightmare, the product of too much coffee and too little sleep. But the knife was still in his trunk, its blade still bearing the names of people who had probably been just like him, runners who stopped when they shouldn't have. He tried to go to the police, but what could he tell them? That he'd been attacked by a man whose eyes glowed in the dark, only to be saved by something that shouldn't exist? That there was a knife covered in names that might be a record of murders stretching back decades? They think he was crazy. Hell, he thought he was crazy. So he did what he'd always done. He ran. He got a job at a bookstore in Portland, rented a small apartment, started a new life. He never told anyone about what happened that night at Exit 23. But sometimes, late at night when he can't sleep, Tom thinks about what he saw in those woods. He thinks about how the darkness had moved, had reached, had protected him for reasons he would never understand. And he thinks about how, ever since that night, his shadow sometimes seems to move in ways that shadows shouldn't. Sometimes, when he's alone, he swears it waves to him. And sometimes, on nights when the moon is hiding and the world feels empty, he waves back. The knife is still in his trunk. He's tried to get rid of it several times, threw it in the ocean once, buried it in the woods another time. But it always comes back, appearing in his trunk the next morning as if it had never left. New names appear on the blade sometimes. He doesn't know how or when they're added, but every few months, there's a fresh one. He looks them up when he can. These names, every single one belongs to someone who went missing on that stretch of I-95. He's thought about going back to the mini-mart at exit 23. He's even driven past it a few times during daylight hours. It looks normal enough in the sun. Just another aging rest stop slowly being reclaimed by nature. But he knows better now. The mini-mart is still there, its fluorescent lights still flickering against the darkness. But these days, fewer people stop there at night. Maybe it's because of the stories, whispered tales of travelers who went in but never came out. Or maybe it's because of the shadows that seem to cluster around the building like hungry dogs, waiting for something only they can see. The locals say that if you drive past late enough at night, you might see a man standing in the parking lot, staring into the woods with a look of desperate longing on his face. They say he's been searching for something he lost in those woods, something he can never get back. But that's just a story, isn't it? Tom doesn't know anymore. What he does know is this. Every time a new name appears on the knife, his shadow gets a little darker, a little more substantial. Sometimes he catches it moving when he's standing still, reaching out towards something he can't see. And sometimes, in his dreams, he sees what his shadow is reaching for. That vast, impossible thing from the woods, waiting patiently for him to understand what it wants, what it saved him for. Because Tom knows now that he wasn't saved out of kindness or mercy. He was saved because the thing in the woods needed someone to remember, someone to keep its story alive, someone to guard the knife and watch the names accumulate, one by one, like entries in a ledger of the dead. The lights keep flickering at exit 23, and the shadows keep waiting, and somewhere in the darkness between the trees, something that isn't quite darkness anymore remembers what it feels like to be human, and it waits, and it watches. And sometimes, if you listen very carefully on a quiet night, you can hear it whisper your name. Sarah found Tom eventually, of course. They all find their runners sooner or later. She tracked him down at the bookstore 6 months after that night at exit 23, looking exactly as he remembered her, except for the shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there before. "You just disappeared," she said. I thought something had happened to you." Tom looked at her for a long moment, then at his shadow on the wall behind her, darker than it should have been, more defined. It seemed to lean towards Sarah, reaching out with limbs that weren't quite arms. "Something did happen to me," Tom said, watching his shadow retreat as Sarah stepped closer. "But you wouldn't believe me if I told you." Sarah's laugh was brittle, like ice cracking on a pond. "Try me. After you disappeared, I hired a private investigator. He tracked your credit card usage up until exit 23, and then nothing. Like you'd vanished into thin air." "The police said." "The police?" Tom interrupted, his heart suddenly hammering. "You went to the police?" "Of course I went to the police. My husband disappeared without a word. What was I supposed to do?" Tom noticed she was still wearing her wedding ring. The sight of it made something twist inside his chest. Not love, exactly, but something older and more complicated. Like muscle memory, but for emotions he thought he'd buried. "What did they tell you about exit 23? He asked carefully. Sarah's expression changed, subtle but noticeable. They said there had been other disappearances there, over the years. But none of the cases were ever solved." She paused, studying his face. "Tom, what happened to you that night?" Before he could answer, the overhead lights in the bookstore flickered. Once, twice, 3 times. Tom's shadow danced on the wall, its movements not quite matching his own. He saw Sarah's eyes track to it, saw the moment she realized something wasn't quite right. "Tom," her voice was smaller now, uncertain. "Why is your shadow?" The lights went out completely. In the darkness, Tom could hear Sarah's breathing, quick and shallow. He knew what she was seeing, or rather, what she was about to see. His shadow didn't need light to be visible anymore. If anything, it was more distinct in the darkness, a deeper black against the regular dark, moving with a fluid grace that suggested joints in places where joints shouldn't be. "Oh God," Sarah whispered. "Oh God, what is that?" "That's what saved me," Tom said quietly. "At exit 23, there was a man with a knife, and then there was something else. Something that lived in the darkness between the trees." The emergency lights kicked in, casting everything in a dim red glow. Sarah's face was pale, her eyes wide as she watched Tom's shadow continue to move independently, reaching toward her with appendages that weren't quite arms. "The private investigator," Tom said suddenly, remembering something. "What was his name?" Sarah tore her eyes away from the shadow. "What?" "The investigator you hired. What was his name?" "Marcus. Marcus Delaney." "Why?" Tom closed his eyes. Marcus Delaney. The newest name that had appeared on the knife 3 weeks ago. He'd looked it up, but hadn't made the connection until now. "He went to exit 23, didn't he? Following my trail?" Sarah nodded slowly. "He said he had a lead. That was the last time I heard from him." Tom's shadow writhed on the wall, and he could feel its hunger, not for flesh or blood, but for something else. For connections. For stories. For the threads that tied one disappearance to another, creating a web of darkness that stretched across decades. "You need to leave," Tom said. "Now. Go back to Boston. Go back to David." Sarah flinched. "How did you?" "It doesn't matter. What matters is that you need to forget about exit 23. Forget about Marcus Delaney. Forget about me." "Tom, you're scaring me." "Good. You should be scared." He stepped closer, close enough to smell her perfume. The same one she'd worn when they first met. "Because the thing that saved me? It's not finished. It's never finished. And now it knows about you." The overhead lights came back on suddenly, harsh and bright. Tom's shadow snapped back to normal, or what passed for normal these days. Sarah was staring at him with a mixture of fear and concern that made him think of how his grandmother had looked at him that last time he'd seen her, right before she disappeared. His grandmother. Another piece clicked into place. "Sarah," he said, his voice urgent now. "My grandmother's house in Maine. Did you ever go through her things after she disappeared?" "What?" "No. The police sealed everything off as part of the investigation. They never found." "Tom, what does this have to do with anything?" "Everything. It has to do with everything." He grabbed his coat from behind the counter. "I need to go to Maine." "I'm coming with you," Sarah said immediately. "No, absolutely not. Tom, I've spent 6 months wondering if you were dead. If I had to identify your body someday. I'm not letting you disappear again." His shadow twitched at her words, and Tom knew he couldn't stop her. The thing in the darkness had plans of its own, and somehow Sarah was part of them now. "Fine," he said, "but we need to make a stop first." "Where?" "Exit 23. There's something I need to show you." The drive north was tense with unspoken words and uncomfortable truths. Sarah kept glancing at Tom's shadow, cast on the road by the headlights of passing cars. Each time it moved wrong, a ripple here, a twist there. She would grip the armrest tighter, her knuckles white in the dashboard lights. They reached exit 23 just after midnight. The mini-mart's fluorescent lights buzzed in the darkness, drawing moths and memories in equal measure. The rusted Ford pickup was still there, its I Heart Suit maned bumper sticker a faded whisper of better days. "Your grandmother," Sarah said suddenly as they sat in the car, watching the lights flicker. "She disappeared 30 years ago, didn't she?" Tom nodded. "They found her car at a rest stop. In Maine." He turned to look at her. "With a bumper sticker just like that one." Sarah's eyes widened as she looked at the abandoned pickup truck. "Tom, are you saying?" But before she could finish, something moved in the darkness beyond the mini-mart. Something vast and patient, something that had been waiting 30 years for Tom to understand what his grandmother had known all along. Everything's got its own song, Tommy. Some songs we're not meant to understand. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to learn this one. The knife in his trunk seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat as Tom reached for the door handle. Behind him, Sarah made a small, frightened sound as his shadow stretched across the parking lot, reaching toward the woods where the darkness waited. Waited for them both. "Tom," Sarah whispered. "What are we doing here?" "Finding answers," he said, and opened the door. Or maybe becoming part of the question. The fluorescent lights flickered one final time as they stepped out of the car, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called out. The same haunting note his grandmother used to whistle while tending her garden, right before she too had become part of the song that lived in the darkness between the trees. The knife was heavier than Tom remembered as he lifted it from the trunk. In the flickering light from the mini-mart, The names carved into the blade seemed to shift and dance, like insects crawling across metal. Sarah gasped when she saw them. Are those names? Tom confirmed. Every person who disappeared here. His finger traced one particular name, carved near the handle in shaky letters. Margaret Bradbury. His grandmother. The wind picked up, bringing with it the smell of pine and something else. Something old and patient, like the musty pages of a book that hadn't been opened in decades. Tom's shadow stretched toward the tree-line, no longer even pretending to follow his movements. Your grandmother, Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. She knew about this place, didn't she? Not just knew about it. Tom pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket, a page torn from his grandmother's diary that he'd found hidden in his old childhood books. She was its keeper. The diary entry was dated June 15, 1993, the day before she disappeared. The shadows are hungry tonight. They've been feeding for so long, but it's never enough. Someone has to watch them, guide them, keep them from taking the wrong ones. I thought I could control it, like my mother before me and her mother before her. But the darkness is patient. It doesn't need to rush. It has all the time in the world. Tommy, if you're reading this, I'm sorry. The legacy was supposed to pass to your mother, but she died before I could tell her. Now it has to be you. The shadows have already chosen. I've seen the way they reach for you when you sleep. Remember what I told you about songs? Every shadow has its own melody. Listen carefully. When you hear it, you'll understand. Tom, Sarah's voice cracked slightly. What is this? What legacy? Before he could answer, the darkness between the trees moved. Not like a shadow or a trick of light, but like something alive, something vast and ancient that had worn the shape of darkness for so long it had forgotten any other form. Sarah screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the night. Tom's shadow detached itself completely, flowing across the parking lot like ink in water, merging with the larger darkness that was now pouring from the woods. And then Tom heard it. The song. It wasn't music, not really. It was the sound of autumn leaves crumbling to dust, the whisper of shadows lengthening across empty rooms, the silence between heartbeats, his grandmother's voice, singing him to sleep on nights when the monsters under his bed felt too real. They're not monsters, he said aloud, finally understanding. They're guardians. The darkness coalesced into something almost human-shaped, but wrong in ways that made the mind slip sideways trying to comprehend it. It held out what might have been a hand, and in it was another knife. Older, rustier, with different names carved into its blade. His grandmother's knife. The wrong ones, Tom said, remembering the diary entry. You keep them from taking the wrong ones. The figure nodded, its movement like smoke in wind. The man with the knife, Sarah said suddenly. The one who tried to kill you. He was one of the wrong ones? They all were, Tom realized. Every person who disappeared here. They were killers, weren't they? Predators. He looked at the knife in his hand, really looked at it. These aren't their victims' names. These are their names. The shadow figure nodded again. Its form rippled, and for a moment Tom saw his grandmother's face within it, not as she'd been at the end, but as he remembered her from his childhood, strong and certain and unafraid of the dark. That's why you saved me, he said. Not because I was special, because I was chosen. Like her, like all the women in our family. The shadow reached out with its not-quite hand and touched Tom's chest, right over his heart. The sensation was like ice and electricity and falling into a very deep well. Images flooded his mind. His grandmother standing guard at exit 23, her knife gleaming in the darkness. Her mother before her, watching the shadows dance at another rest stop in Maine. Generations of watchers, keeping the darkness fed, keeping it focused on the ones who deserved its hunger. Tom, Sarah's voice seemed to come from very far away. Your eyes. He knew without looking that they were reflecting the light now, just like the man with the knife. But unlike that man, Tom understood what the reflection meant. It was a mark, a sign of being chosen, either as predator or protector. The shadow figure held out his grandmother's knife again, offering, inviting. If I take it, Tom said, I'll have to stay, won't I? Become the new keeper? The figure's head tilted, and Tom heard his grandmother's voice in his mind. Everything's got its own song, Tommy. He reached for the knife. Sarah grabbed his arm. Tom, don't. Please. We can leave right now, drive away. Forget any of this happened. He turned to look at her, really look at her, and saw something he hadn't noticed before. Her shadow wasn't quite right either. It had been reaching toward the darkness this whole time, moving with the same fluid grace as his own. You see it too, don't you? He asked. The wrongness in people. That's why you knew about David, about what he really was, long before you caught us. You just didn't want to admit what you were seeing. Sarah's hand fell away from his arm. I always knew when people were wrong. Inside. I thought I was just good at reading people. The shadow figure rippled again, and this time 2 hands emerged from the darkness, each holding a knife. One for Tom, one for Sarah. We were chosen, Tom said softly. Both of us. That's why you had to find me. Why you couldn't let it go. Sarah stared at the offered knife, her expression a mixture of fear and recognition. If we take them, what happens to us? We become what we were meant to be, Tom said. What my grandmother was. What we already are, really. He took his knife. After a moment's hesitation, Sarah took hers. The darkness surged around them like a wave, and Tom heard the song again. Clearer now, stronger. A melody of shadows and secrets, of justice dealt in dark places, of balance maintained through countless nights. The mini-mart's lights flickered one last time and went out completely. When they came back on, the parking lot was empty except for a rusted Ford pickup with a faded bumper sticker. But if you drive past exit 23 late at night, you might see 2 figures standing in the shadows. Their eyes gleam like cat's eyes in the darkness, and their shadows move in ways that shadows shouldn't. They're watching, waiting, keeping the darkness hungry but focused, protecting travelers from the real monsters that prowl the highways at night. And if you listen very carefully, you might hear them singing. It's not a song you're meant to understand, but it's a song that's been sung for generations, passed down from mother to daughter, from grandmother to grandson. A melody of shadows and justice and choices made in the dark. Some say the mini-mart at exit 23 is haunted. Others say it's a place where bad people go to disappear. Both are true, in their way. But the real truth is simpler. It's a place where the darkness knows what you've done, what you're planning to do. And if you're one of the wrong ones, one of the monsters wearing human skin, then you'd better keep driving. Because Tom and Sarah are watching, and their shadows are always hungry. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Your support helps us keep going, and we can't wait to bring you even more stories. Stay tuned.